But that year was a real challenge. It was the year that, while I was on my type rating, the second one, my brother had his motorbike accident in New Zealand and he wasn't expected to survive. And I thought about stopping my type rating to go out there and be with him, and realised there was nothing I could do if I went out. All I would be doing would be stopping myself from doing the type rating. I couldn't make him better. He wasn't conscious. I couldn't make him survive. I wasn't needed there. So I carried on with my type rating. And then later on in the year, I was staying at my mum and dad's still, came back at about 2 in the morning and went to bed and shut my bedroom door, and woke up about 6 thinking, what's that weird burning smell? And I opened my bedroom door. Everything between me and their bedroom was just filled with smoke. And I didn't even know if they were alive. They were, fortunately, and we managed to get out of the house just as the smoke turned into flames. And basically I stood outside watching my parents' house burn down. And then finally, to cap off that year, the government decided to get rid of the Nimrod aircraft, which my husband worked on, closed the base at Kinloss where we lived, and he was posted south. And it just felt like wave after wave after wave of challenge and sort of shock news, and how are we going to manage this? Yeah, it had its moments that year. It was the year that went on giving.
So, Captain Emma Henderson, how did you, or when did you start your flying training?
Well, I had my first lesson at 18, and then I joined the University Air Squadron at 20. So I had 2 years flying in a little bulldog around Yorkshire, occasionally getting lost. And then I got married and had the children, so I stopped. So we moved out to New Zealand, and my husband said to me, well, you could pick up your flying training again, and you could actually finish with a private pilot's license. So I did, but I said to him, the caveat to that is that if I start flying again, I'm not stopping this time. So you've got to be prepared for the fact that somehow we're going to have to find a way to make that commercial, because we couldn't afford for me to just fly for fun. And I said, actually, I don't want to fly for fun. I want to fly. I wanted to fly commercially. I'd actually wanted to fly. If I ever had flown, it was always going to be for EasyJet, because they basically launched in '95, which was the year we got married. And their first route was Luton, Glasgow, and the second route was Luton, Aberdeen. And that opened up to those of us that lived in the north of Scotland at the time the possibility to get down to see our families. We only had to drive an hour and a half to Aberdeen, and we only had to spend 60 quid on a flight to get to Luton, which was only an hour from my mum and dad's, whereas previously it was like 400 quid on a KLM Air UK flight to get home. So EasyJet, you know, we flew, it was a revelation to us that we could suddenly afford to fly to see our family. And I did say to Jim, I remember taking a flight with him one day and saying, if I do ever fly again, it's going to be for this lot. And that was back in the days of orange sort of T-shirts, and cabin crew wore black jeans and stuff. And I'm pretty sure I saw sellotape holding the wings on a couple of occasions. Wasn't quite that bad. But, you know, I always wanted, I thought, what a great airline, what great innovation. But I never really thought it would happen. And then, of course, New Zealand changed the course of my life, because I came back having spent 3.5 years flying around Auckland and the North Island of New Zealand, and sometimes in the South Island, and doing some mountain flying, for example. You haven't really been mountain flying if you haven't been mountain flying in New Zealand. And I came back as a fully qualified commercial pilot, but I couldn't get a job. I applied, all the airlines I applied to said, well, most of them didn't reply. The only one that did was GB, who said, thank you very much, but we're not taking people on at the moment. And they were taken over by EasyJet not long afterwards. So I managed to get a scholarship from what was then called the Guild of Air Pilots and Air Navigators, and it's now called the Honourable Company of Air Pilots. And I was awarded the only once ever awarded Diamond Jubilee Scholarship to become an instructor. And so that's what I went on to do next. I had to, when I came back from New Zealand, I had to convert all the exams to European licensing. So I had to sit the 16 ATPL exams and all the rest of it, and convert my actual flying license. And we were living in Marlow. My husband was at High Wycombe. So I did my instructor rating at Wickham Air Centre and then became an instructor there. And I worked as an instructor for 3 years, firstly at Wickham, and then we moved back up to Scotland. So I instructed at Kinloss, and then I got lucky really because EasyJet opened up their type rating to people who already had licenses, and they took 12 of us on to a type rating course. And partway through, they said, we haven't actually got enough instructors available this summer to get you through the training, so you can all go away and come back again in a year. So I went back to then Inverness and became the chief flying instructor at Highland Aero Club and did that for a year before EasyJet recalled me. So there was an awful lot of luck thrown in there, but there was also a lot of determination, and I wasn't kind of going to let this chance pass me by.
You made your own luck, I think, with that story.
Definitely.
You know, I mean, it's about taking the opportunities that are presented to you, and it's maybe luck that opportunity appears, but you have to then make the most of that opportunity.
Yeah, and this is something I talk about quite a lot because, you know, I see opportunities as doors that you can push on. And I think that you should push on doors and see if they open, because you just don't know what's going to lie beyond them. Some doors can't open unless other doors have already closed. And that's definitely the case with, you know, my career in the flight deck and what went on to happen next. But some doors won't open, and we have to actually acknowledge that and learn when to stop pushing. Because I think sometimes you see people banging away at something, trying to do something, you think, not going to happen. And they have to find that out for themselves. But actually, we have to sometimes be brave and say, well, that door's not opening, I'll go and try another one.
And how would you suggest someone can go about finding that bravery? Because you have to be hugely brave to make changes or to go, this course of action, it's not working, I'm going to try something else. I don't know what, but I'm going to find another route. How can they go about it?
I think that if it's something you really want to do, I don't think you need to be that brave. I think you tend to think first or act first and think later. So, you know, I know we're going to come on to this, but setting up the charity, there was no planning in that, and there was no bravery in that. It was just a case of, here's an opportunity to do something that will help other people. Let's do it. And so I suppose it is bravery in a sense. It's the bravery of putting yourself outside your comfort zone and making a change. It's more about being comfortable with change and just realising that you're still in control. You are literally in control of every change you make. If you start to make a change and you realise it's not what you want, you can always undo that. You know, there are clearly some things you can't undo, but on the whole, most of the things that we would choose to make changes to in our lives are reversible, or you can go in a different direction. And, you know, choosing the harder path is often the more interesting path to take. So it's just about being open to all the opportunities that are going to come your way if you do choose to make a change.
So Emma, part of your career as a professional speaker is talking about change management. And it's really interesting hearing about your lessons from moving to New Zealand. But also you talk about the lessons that you've learned from, in your words, behind the locked and bulletproof flight deck door, and how we can take those to managing change in the real world outside of flying. So maybe you could share with our viewers and listeners some of those tips and tricks and skills that you've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really interesting when I left. I took voluntary redundancy from EasyJet in 2020. And as a result of that, I was provided with a kind of career consultant and I sat in this Zoom chat with him one day, and he said, so, you know, what transferable skills do you have? And I said, well, I haven't got any. I've flown for, you know, I left university, I had babies, I went flying, and now I've flown a plane for, you know, the last 12 years. And that's all I can do really. So I kind of need to find some skills. And he said, well, I don't think that's quite true. He said, just run me through a typical day. So I sort of spoke to him about what a day might look like. And he said, well, actually, that's change management, that's resilience, that's leadership, that's decision making. And I had all these skills, transferable skills, that I didn't even realise I had. And the years I spent in a flight deck, I think firstly that the reason people are so fascinated by pilots and what they do at work is because that door is locked and bulletproof. And obviously pre 9/11, one of the things I got to do as a kid was go, you know, my dad would always say, would you like to go and see the pilots? And we'd go, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it's because actually secretly he wanted to. But, you know, you just walked up the front and went behind the curtain, and they would just let you sit in their seats and everything. And that doesn't happen anymore. So I think that world is quite mysterious to people. But actually, when you're in that little room at the front of the aircraft, all kinds of things happen all the time. So, and the passengers will not always even know about it. But, even taking an aircraft over at the beginning of the day, you can get on board an aircraft, turn it on. It's largely electrical when you're switching it on, and anything can not work. So suddenly your day that maybe you're supposed to be departing at 6 o'clock from X airport to go to Y airport, and then you're going to go on to somewhere else or back there and then on to somewhere else, suddenly that becomes a challenge because you're not going to be on schedule. That's change management. You're working out, how is this going to impact the rest of my day? How's that going to impact my crew? Is anyone going out of hours? Is anyone on days off the next day, especially if it's a late flight? So actually, in just doing your job, you are managing change in a way that you're making sure other people are going to be looked after as a result of that. And you're doing that all the time. The weather might have changed when you get to your airport, your destination. If you've got a flight that's 5 hours away, that's a long time in weather. And all kinds of things can happen. So you're constantly having to be adaptable. You have to learn how to be very adaptable, I think, as an airline pilot, because even if your day has gone to plan, the chances are you're going to land and tomorrow's roster's changed to something else. So if you've got children and you're expecting to be home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because that's what you're rostered to do, and suddenly you pick up a change and now you're not going to be home till 6 o'clock, how do you manage that? You could probably refuse the flight, but actually you also need to make sure that you know that you've got people in place to support you in order to be able to manage those changes that are you're affecting everybody else as well. So I think I hadn't realised actually that I'd spent such a lot of my life managing changes at work that actually gave me skills that I could use outside of flying and outside of aviation and in business, as it turned out as well. When we set up Project Wingman, it was all about change management. I mean, nothing stays the same in Wingman for more than about 5 minutes.
So what skills do you draw on then to be good at change, to be adaptable, to be able to respond to those changes and just to, keep calm under pressure?
Well, I think that certainly in the flight deck, the worse things have got, the more relaxed I get. And I think that I was reading a really interesting article only this week actually about how flight crew particularly become emotionally detached from their surroundings, because you cannot be emotional about an engine catching fire. That has never happened to me, by the way. But the things that have happened to me, passengers being, if you have a medical emergency and you're spending all your time thinking about that poor passenger down the back, it must be awful for their family, you're not going to be focused on the job that you're paid to do. So you have to kind of remove yourself from the emotional side of it. It's there and you have to process it at some point, but you don't necessarily have to process it immediately. So I think it's just that emotional detachment and focus on the job you're there to do. That emotion does come, but my initial reaction is always, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this? How are we going to fix this? How are we going to change it? And I think that is something that is prevalent in most air crew that you admit, most flight crew. I think that is a skill and a behavioural characteristic that we all have. So actually change is just something that I think you have to learn to say, okay, well, what's that going to mean for the rest of my day? What's that going to mean for my business? What's that going to mean for the rest of my life? You can't do anything you're not going to make it different by getting wound up about it and starting ranting and raving and all the rest of it. You just have to go through a process. And of course, pilots are taught a decision-making process. You have to go through a process to work out, okay, so what are our options here? How are we going to manage this? Once you put a framework in place, actually change management is really simple. And it's it's the bread and butter really of flying. The flying bit is the fun bit. The way you earn your money is the bit where you're managing change all the time, every single day.
One of the things we talk about a lot here on Inspirability is, and what you've just said, is that you can't control what's going to happen. If you've got a passenger having a heart attack, an engine catching fire, or some of the problems that your friends have faced and have come to you with. But what you're doing is you're taking control of the situation by controlling your response, whether you're using a failure management strategy or tool, or and how you're responding to the situation. So what can you share with our viewers and listeners about how they can take control of a situation that maybe feels outside of their control initially?
Well, the first thing I think is you've just got to find out what's actually going on. If you're in control of a situation, what you're removing is fear. And actually, I find that with the fear of flying things that I did at EasyJet, but also I work with a charity called Love Fly that still does fear of flying for people all over the world, actually. And if you remove fear from a situation, you're actually giving people back control. And that was why I would go out into the cabin and do my welcome on board PAs every single flight, whether there was something wrong or not. It wasn't about me going, "Hi, I'm Emma, I'm a pilot, and I want to show off." It was about showing people on board, 20% of which on most flights are scared of flying. It was about showing them there's a real person at the front of this aircraft who's flying you, who also wants to get home to their families. You are in safe hands. That was the message I was putting out.
You're relatable, aren't you?
Absolutely.
With doing that.
I'm not just a detached voice coming through a tannoy. And I think just if you remove the fear from it and you're in control of it, then actually you look at change and you think, okay, I just risk assess everything now without really even realising it. Even talking about perhaps catching my flight home tonight. If the traffic picks up later and I don't get the car back to my daughter's house in London on my way home, and then I miss my flight, I've got two things I can do. I can go, "Oh no, I'm going to miss my flight. This is all really awful." And all that's going to do is put my blood pressure up, probably shave a few minutes off my life, which I want to be as long as possible because I haven't even got started yet. And the other option is I can go, "Okay, I'll fly home tomorrow then. I'll stay with my brother-in-law for another night." There's always options. And there's always different choices that you can make that make change less of an issue. There's literally nothing you can do about it. So control the controllables, a very wise former base captain once said to me. And that's absolutely right. Be in control of the things that you can be in control of, but accept and acknowledge that sometimes there are things that happen that you just can't influence. And that doesn't matter whether it's something that's happened to one of your children, or whether it's traffic on the way home, or your husband's base being closed when you weren't expecting it to be, and changing the whole course of your life. You just have to deal with, you have to sort of suck it up, basically, which is not the same thing as saying you deserve this to happen, but you just have to go, okay, here's a new set of circumstances I'm presented with. How am I going to make that work? It's always about finding a solution.
Something that we touched on earlier was you were saying about sometimes being emotionally detached from a situation when you're dealing with an emergency, like an engine on fire, as we talked about. But then at some point you need to process it, because bottling it up can then lead to sort of other, more serious problems with mental health. So how do you find that balance, and when do you, or how do you decompress?
Well, that's where the support network comes in. So, I have a very close relationship with my parents. I'm very lucky. They live just a short walk through the woods. They moved up to Scotland to join us. I'm very lucky that I have a very close and supportive family. But I also have a beach that is less than half a mile from my house. And I can tell you with an absolute certainty that there is nothing that could ever happen to me that would be made worse by going and walking on that beach. That I've worked through a lot of problems on that beach, just walking, swimming, hanging out with friends. It's kind of a safe space for me, and it is a space you kind of get quite a lot of perspective, especially on a windy day with big waves and things. And you think, do you know what? These problems aren't necessarily the worst thing that could ever happen. It might feel like it's pretty bad now, but I know that actually it will be all right in the end. That's a really good, that makes me feel really good. And there's actually something scientific about, if you connect with the earth, it's supposed to be really good for your well-being. And if you go cold water swimming, there's actually a nerve in the back of your neck that produces dopamine, and it's triggered by cold water, and it just makes you feel better. So actually going swimming in the sea, they're two things that really benefit me and my well-being. And I genuinely feel like a different person when I've done either of those things.
What advice would you give to someone then about finding ways to help improve their mental health, or finding ways to decompress? Because you found cold water swimming. What other advice could you give to someone who's maybe looking for ways just to manage anxiety?
Well, one of the things that we talk about quite a lot in the aviation industry is your capacity bucket, and we've all got one, and all of us have stuff in it already. So, it might be that you've got elderly parents that you're caring for. Whatever it is that is in your bucket already is taking up some capacity. And then through the day, some people talk about it in terms of pebbles, but I talk about it in terms of water, because water drips into it throughout the day, and more and more goes into your bucket. You have to find a way of letting water out of the bottom of the bucket. And it's about having some quiet. It's about turning the noise off at some point, I think, because we do live in a high octane we all live high octane lives in a very, very busy, loud, pressured world where success is seen as something that you achieve by doing as much as possible, as much of the time as you can. And actually, there is a lot to be said for the still, calm spaces that you need to create for yourself in order to just allow your brain to process things. So actually, for me, I switch my phone off or I'll just leave it somewhere. I don't always want to be answering phone calls. If you're going swimming, you can't be contactable anyway because you're in the sea. And finding spaces. So religion would call it meditation. Christianity would call it prayer. A lot of religions that involve a God would call it prayer or meditation or whatever. They're not missing a trick there. Whatever you call it, that those quiet spaces are essential for you to be able to, your brain has to be able to sort of file stuff away in its filing cabinets, if you like. And it can only do that if you stop overloading it all the time. So I just think it's really important. It doesn't matter how you do it, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's it could be going down the pub with your mates and having a laugh. Whatever switches you off from the constant kind of clatter of day to day, that's what helps you to process and decompress. And actually, when it comes to delving into people's problems, you have to talk about it at some point. And if you can't talk to your friends about it, you need to talk to somebody who is a professional support worker or a counsellor. And that's actually what Project Wingman is all about, is providing a safe space where actually you're coming on board our bus to have a cup of tea and a biscuit, but it is an opportunity for you to then say, actually, do you know what? This has happened in my life. And then there's an opportunity to refer you into professional services for support. But making sure you've got that support network and that space to process things, they would be the two things. Friends and space is the short answer.
So we'll talk about Project Wingman in a moment, because I really want to talk about that. But you were talking about the stress bucket earlier, and something that I think is really interesting with that is you're talking about things coming into the stress bucket. What about taking control over what comes in? And where I'm going with that is sometimes saying no to things.
Absolutely. We are all, I think, really bad at saying no. And I think women particularly are bad at saying no. I think because we just want to help where we can. I know I'm really bad at saying no. And actually a friend of mine quite often texts me and just says, Zammo, because anyone who's older like me who will remember Grange Hill, there was a character in this programme called Grange Hill called Zammo. And the whole campaign around that story was to say no to drugs. And the slogan was just say no. And, I just take on too much a lot of the time. And it's really, really liberating when you turn around to say to someone, I'd love to help, but I absolutely can't, sorry. I have a tendency when somebody tells me something really awful to want to get involved and say, well, how can I help with this? Let's get you round for dinner. Let's look after you. And actually, I don't have space in my head for that at the moment, particularly. I've got other things that I need to prioritise. And that's okay. It's really liberating when you say, yeah, do you know what? I need to just prioritise the things I'm already doing. And I'm really sorry that your situation's really awful, but I'm not the person that can make that better for you. I'm not going to stop being friends with you, but I can't fix your broken marriage or whatever it is that people have come to you with. I can't get involved in that. So you have to be quite disciplined about what you take on and what you choose not to take on. And
you're not spreading yourself too thinly either, because if you try and do lots of things and spread yourself too thinly, then everyone isn't getting the best of Captain Emma Henderson.
Exactly. And neither am I, importantly. If I'm not giving myself the best chance, then I'm not the best person to be able to help other people either. So my sort of little strapline to myself has become do less well. And I don't mean do worse, I mean do less, comma, well. The importance of punctuation.
Absolutely. And I think that must have helped you with, leadership in your career as an airline captain. So talking about your flying training before EasyJet and then with EasyJet, were there any points that you struggled with and that maybe you could share some coping strategies with our viewers and listeners for overcoming adversity?
How long have you got? Yeah, definitely. So in my first year at Stansted, so I started at Stansted because mum and dad were half an hour down the road, and we were living in Scotland, so I actually stayed with them in my working week, which was a real gift to move back in as a 30-something-year-old adult who hadn't actually got divorced or got some awful thing going on that they'd had to move in. I got to move back into and kind of became friends with my parents rather than them telling me what to do all the time. I mean, they still do that, obviously, but that year was a real challenge. It was the year that while I was on my type rating, the second one, my brother had his motorbike accident in New Zealand and he wasn't expected to survive. So put my mum on a plane out to New Zealand immediately. Dad followed a couple of days later. I looked after everything back at home for them. And I thought about stopping my type rating to go out there and be with him, and realised there was nothing I could do if I went out. All I would be doing would be stopping myself from doing the type rating. I couldn't make him better. He wasn't conscious. I couldn't make him survive. My mum and dad were there. I wasn't needed there. So I carried on with my type rating. A few months later, my husband, who had been telling me ever since I'd sort of left to go and do the type rating, I'm losing weight. I'm tired all the time. I feel like I'm dehydrated all the time, all his symptoms, but I think I've got diabetes. And I'd be like, don't be ridiculous. You're running around after the children. That's why you're tired. You're dehydrated, you're not drinking enough. Make sure you drink plenty of water, blah, blah, blah. He had diabetes and it was diagnosed. He wouldn't go and see the doctor. He said, I'll wait till my medical, which was always on his birthday. And so it was actually on his 40th birthday, he was diagnosed with an autoimmune triggered diabetes. Now, that made a huge change to us in terms of lifestyle, but actually it threatened our lifestyle. It threatened our lifestyle because at the time we didn't know if he was going to be medically discharged from the Air Force. Could he stay in the Air Force with diabetes? Could he stay flying? Probably not. So we didn't know if we were going to lose his job, therefore his income, and therefore our ability to pay the mortgage, because I certainly wasn't earning enough to cover that in my early days at EasyJet. So that was a challenge that that was a few months into 2010. And then later on in the year, I was staying at my mum and dad's still. We had been at a family wedding. Jim and the kids had flown home and I went and did a late Alicante, came back at about 2 a.m. and went to bed and shut my bedroom door and woke up about 6 thinking, what's that weird burning smell? And I thought maybe I'd left a camera charger. It smelled like burning plastic. And I sort of switched the light on, looked around the room, couldn't see anything, switched the light off. I thought, no, that smell's getting worse. And I opened my bedroom door and everything between me and their bedroom was just filled with smoke. And I didn't even know if they were alive. They were, fortunately. And we managed to get out of the house just as the smoke turned into flames. And basically I stood outside watching my parents' house burn down, which it didn't burn down completely, but it was really devastating for my parents. It was kind of upsetting for me, but my house hadn't caught fire. And then finally, to cap off that year, the government decided to get rid of the Nimrod aircraft, which my husband worked on, closed the base at Kinloss where we lived, and he was posted south. And we had literally just put our children, our oldest, all of them had just started at boarding school nearby to where we live. And we'd said to them, don't worry, we're never going away because Kinloss will always be open and we'll always come back. And we spent the next 7 years living down in London, basically, while they spent their school careers at Gordonston. So they were very lucky to go there, but that was not how I had planned our life to work out at all. And it just felt like wave after wave after wave of challenge and sort of shock news and how are we going to manage this. And I was learning my craft. You know, I had just started my job. I was learning how to be a first officer in the right-hand seat of an Airbus that carried 150 to 180 people, depending on which model it was. And it was a challenge. It was hard work. It was, you know, trying to get your head around all this massive steep learning curve of going from light aircraft into an airline and having all of that thrown at you all the time as well. It was kind of, yeah, it had its moments that year. It was the year that went on giving.